Welcome again to today's webinar, the Hudson Valley Nonprofit Economic Impact Study, sponsored by our great supporters, Hudson Valley Funders Network. I'm going to pass it over to Andrea Reynolds, President and CEO of Dyson Foundation. Andrea? Whoop, we have you on mute.
All right, thank you, Sue. I appreciate that.
Sure.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today to learn more about the commissioned report, Mission and More, the Economic Power of the Hudson Valley's Nonprofit Sector. This is the second of two webinars sponsored by the Hudson Valley Funders Network, a group of Hudson Valley funders who came together to address nonprofit capacity needs during the pandemic. As a network, we have decided to continue to provide support for our partner nonprofits for the foreseeable future. The first webinar on the American Rescue Funds was to learn from nonprofits on how best funders can help nonprofits access those funds. A recording of that webinar can be found along with additional webinars, information, resources, and access to technical assistance provided by NICON at our website, hudsonvalleyfundersnetwork.org. Today's webinar is a follow-on, which we hope will help strengthen funding requests with information on how nonprofits generate significant economic activity and jobs that form the bedrock of our communities. So why did the Hudson Valley Funders Network commission this report? The network had been meeting on a regular basis to learn about the technical assistance nonprofits were accessing through NICON and to be educated on the changing landscape that COVID had created on the local, state, and federal levels. To that end, we hosted a call that included a New York State-focused nonprofit advocate and lobbyist who provided an overview of how the state budget will impact nonprofits. One statement that he made that struck us was that in their conversations with elected officials, nonprofits do a great job of telling electeds how they help people. What nonprofits don't do as well is telling elected officials how important nonprofits are to the economy and job creation and retention. So the network commissioned this study that shows the economic importance of Hudson Valley nonprofits, and we hope you can use it to demonstrate the scope, scale, and economic impact of the sector while making the case for increased investment in your mission. Today, we welcome Doug Sauer, independent advisor with the New York Council of Nonprofits, Chelsea Newhouse, the researcher for this study and report, and Yvette Bairan, Chief Executive Officer of Astor Services for Children and Families. Doug will provide an overview of the study. Chelsea will discuss how the county level dashboards work and answer any research questions you may have. And Yvette will provide a nonprofit perspective on how you can use the report as a tool to educate and inform your audiences. Doug?
Okay. Thank you, Andrea. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone. I'm going to just, let me get my, is this all shown? We see it?
Yes.
I'm going to talk a little bit about expand on what Andrea talked about in terms of why we're doing this and what we sought to accomplish, and just give a brief overview of some of the data in the report and some of the key findings. And I would encourage everybody, hopefully you have the report in front of you. We can dig in deeper, you can ask questions later on, but just kind of give a brief, broad overview. As Andrea said, we wanted to really increase the understanding and appreciation of decision makers, stakeholders, the media, the community at large, the public, as to our sector. I'm going to refer to us, economic impact, as well as the challenges. And some of the challenges did come out of this study, including how we were economically during the pandemic. And this is one of the first studies, if not the first, that was done in this period that really showed the impact of the pandemic on economic health of nonprofits in a region. But also in doing so, we had a lot of discussions about, we wanted to dispel what misguided notions and myths that may exist either in the public or among their stakeholders or policy people with respect to the nonprofit sector, and particularly compared to the for-profit sector. Again, we're often called the third leg of the stool behind government and the private sector. And I think as this report shows, we're not a third leg. We're a major part of the economy right along, if not more so in some cases, with government and the private sector. So we really wanted to show that impact in the Hudson Valley region, the 9-county Hudson Valley region. So there were 6 broad findings in the report, and I don't want to get too deep in all the details because there's a lot of comparisons that are done, but we wanted to be able to really highlight the major pieces of it. The study looked at charitable nonprofit organizations that are active. So we weren't looking at every nonprofit corporation out there, or C6s, or there's a lot of nonprofits that are not active in the community. And it came out that there was 7,700 active charitable nonprofits with just over 139,000 paid workers. This is in 2020. That's a lot of workforce, and we're more than any other private sector industry. The sector is 1 out of every 5 non-governmental job. And actually by 1% or so, we exceeded the statewide average. The statewide nonprofit share of private employment statewide, we're 19%, where statewide, I think it was 18.1%. So we're a little bit higher than what's the average in the state, which includes New York City. Interestingly, in 2020, we were just 7% fewer jobs in all levels of government combined in the Hudson Valley. And back in 2010, the last census, that was 28% back. So we're rapidly gaining, and probably next time this is done, we will be at equal or more than government jobs. One of the things that the study did is in the following fields, we looked at different segments of the sector. And compare us to our workforce to the non-government workforce. We were 80% of the jobs in education, 69% in social assistance, and 53% in healthcare. So there's where a lot of the share of the workforce is for our sector. Obviously, healthcare, and particularly during the pandemic, was a critical piece, and there's a strong focus on healthcare, as that half of our workforce are in healthcare. And the hospitals are half of that. Nursing and residential care, close to 1/3 of it, and ambulatory care, 18%. The next largest employer is educational services. And again, this includes the institutions, colleges and universities were 53% by then. 47% of education jobs were private elementary and secondary schools, charter schools and the like, and private schools. Social assistance organizations were 16.5%. 8.4% were other services. Interesting, I found it interesting, only 1.1% are arts, entertainment, and recreation when it comes to the workforce, although the percentage of nonprofits that are in the arts, entertainment, and recreation is much greater than 1% overall, but the workforce itself is only 1.1%. A particular focus was the weekly wages, or nonprofit wages, and our average weekly wages were significantly lower than the for-profit counterparts overall. Higher in some fields, such as nonprofit social assistance and education. But our average weekly wage among all the workforce was $1,025. I quickly figured if you divided that by 40 hours a week, and you get $25 an hour for the entire workforce. Interestingly, that is 76% of what the region's for-profit weekly wages are. We're 23% less than what the for-profit, and this is in 2020 in the pandemic, than what the for-profit industry is in the Hudson region. But we're doing better in the statewide. Statewide nonprofits are 27%. So this is a major piece that we'll come back to a little bit later around the competitive workforce, the tight labor force that we have, and our ability to retain jobs and pay a competitive salary. But critically here, our average weekly wages are significantly lower than for-profits. One of the key purposes here was to show economic health and financial power, and $16 billion in revenue and $23 billion in total assets. That's a lot of economic wealth, a lot of economic force that purchases services, pays employees, invests money in the Hudson Valley region. Our wages paid in 2020 was $7.4 billion. So you can see the impact on that. That's 14.5% of all non-government wages. And interestingly, and Chelsea can talk about this later if folks have questions, we looked at what the potential tax revenue might be from our $7.4 billion in wages that we pay. And it came out to over $1 billion. Without talking, I don't think we're talking about sales tax. I think we're just talking about income taxes and local taxes, that state and federal taxes that are being paid. So the notion, when we talk about dispelling notions, the notions that nonprofits don't contribute to the tax base of the region is ludicrous. We give over $1 billion plus, and that's an important advocacy piece to make. Key finding 5, and this gets into the pandemic, is our workforce and employment fared relatively well during the first year of the pandemic during 2020. We retained 5.4% more of our pre-pandemic workforce than the for-profits. Now, a lot of us were essential industries, but our workforce stayed, and we were able to retain it despite being underpaid during the pandemic period and having the stress of all that. Education paid more than their counterparts, 6.5, or stayed 6.5% higher retention, health 5.5, social assistance 5.3. Interestingly, childcare was nearly 9% more than for-profit childcare organizations. And as we'll talk about later, that will clearly show our resiliency and our commitment to the community, our commitment to our jobs and the people we're serving, and to the region, and particularly during the most troubling and most difficult of times. Also, during this period, our wages did not, even though our workforce stayed at a greater level than the for-profit, our wages did not match the pace of for-profits. The weekly wages did increase in 2020 from 2019. It was 9% increase. And again, there was, for those of you, many of you got PPP money during that period of time, but the for-profit increase in wages was 12%. So they were able to provide more money to compete for a tight workforce. Interesting, the arts, entertainment, and recreation increased 20%, even though they were 1.1% of the workforce. Social services increased, healthcare increased, education increased. So there was an overall increase in wages during this period of time where we're trying to maintain a workforce during a critical period, but we were well behind what the for-profit competitors in the Hudson Valley region were doing. So those are kind of six key findings and just some of the overall conclusions. Obviously, we're critical to the economic health of the regions. Our money matters, but our money we're really about mission. So the money just adds on to the mission impact we have. So when you leverage our economic value with our mission and public good, it's immeasurable and cannot be overstated. The impact we have overall, the social return is tremendous, as well as the economic return. During the peak of the COVID crisis, we were able to significantly retain our workforce, as we said, more than for-profits, and do so with less competitive wages and lots of resiliency and commitment of both the agencies, the boards, and the employees to the mission and service, again, in the most difficult of periods when a lot of folks were not returning to the workforce. The pandemic also magnified the historical disparities in wages. This is something Yvette's going to talk about a little bit with her organization later on, that exists. We've always had not been able to compete with for-profits, and I will argue even more so in some cases with the government sector, which gives pretty good benefits and wages, much better than nonprofits for the most part. And given today's highly competitive labor market, as we're going into this somewhat of an economic recovery, and there's more jobs out there than people looking for jobs, it seriously threatens our ability to attract and retain the workforce needed to sustain our mission, as well as our economic contributions to the region. So that last piece really shows the challenges that we have in the region as nonprofit community, kind of nonprofit employers in the workforce, coming into the next stage of our own recovery and the next economic stage of the region. So with that, I believe I turn that over to Chelsea, correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Doug. If you could reshare that so that I got my slides up, or here, I can do it.
You want me to reshow it?
Yeah, and just go to the next slide with the data summary for me, please. Thank you. While we're doing that, just a little bit about me. I came in to work on this report in the last few months of my tenure at the Johns Hopkins Center for Civil Society Studies, where I managed the Nonprofit Economic Data Project, which has produced over 40 of these sorts of reports over the years. So today I'm going to go very quickly over where we got these data and what some of the limitations are, and I promise I will make this part quick so nobody takes it out. So what this shows is we have two separate data sources in this report. First of all, the financial data, which as Doug talked about, the revenue and assets data, were drawn from 990 filings obtained by the Urban Institute. And our employment and wage data, which was the primary focus of this report, are drawn from the quarterly Census of Employment and Wages using a methodology developed by our center at Johns Hopkins. That is an administrative data set maintained by the Bureau of Labor Statistics in cooperation with state labor agencies, labor security agencies. And it has some really good advantages over other sources of data, and that's why we use it. And they include that there is comprehensive. It includes almost 97 to 98% of all employers in the US. It is regular and reliably produced. It's a quarterly data set, and at least in theory, those data are available within a couple of months of being collected. It is also a comparable data set for nonprofits, which is unique because the QCW gathers data on all employers, nonprofit, for-profit, and government, and puts them into the same fields. So that's an apples to apples comparison. When we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about healthcare, not some crosswalked concept of healthcare. And finally, the QCW data, unlike 990 data and other sources, is highly localized. It gathers data on the establishment level. So the example I like to use is if you have a nonprofit healthcare provider and they have multiple clinics throughout a region, each of those clinics is counted as a separate establishment. So we know where those people are working, where they're being paid, as opposed to simply saying, okay, well, this is in New York State or this is on the East Coast. Doug, could you please advance to the next slide? Thank you. However, there are some limitations to both of these data sources, and I just want to make this clear. So the QCW data has two main limitations, particularly when you're looking at smaller counties or smaller fields. Federal and state laws limit the data that can be released so that you cannot identify individual workers or establishments. So this tends to kick in when you are dealing with a small field in a small area. However, the good news is that those numbers, those workers and wages are included in the totals. So the regional total is not going to, you can't take each of the counties and add them together to get the regional total, but the regional total is comprehensive. And the other issue is timeliness. Currently, the Bureau of Labor Statistics only releases the nonprofit breakout data every 5 years. And that meant that in order to do this study, looking at the first year of the pandemic, we had to go to the New York Department of Labor, which fortunately was able to produce those data. However, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has some additional resources available to them, which makes their data a little bit more comprehensive. So we can't really compare the 2017 data that we have from the Bureau of Labor Statistics to the 2019 and 2020 data that we have from the New York Department of Labor. However, that's why we use the 2019 and 2020 because we can compare them to each other. And for the 990s, Doug cited the huge assets and expenditures. The issue of that, of course, there is that not all nonprofits file full 990. A lot of the smaller nonprofits might have revenues or assets, but they file the 990 EZ and the IRS counts that as a zero. So those numbers are underestimating the actual economic impact, but it's the best view we can get. Okay, so there's your little overview, and I'm going to now share my screen and show you a little bit about the county level dashboard, where you can drill down to see several of these data points that Doug highlighted, but on the county level. All right, I hope everybody can see that. So this is a Tableau dashboard, and what you see when you go into it is the regional data, which is reflective of what's in the report itself. And I'm just going to go quickly through and show you what there is. So here we have the regional data with the 139,123 paid workers in the region. The way that this figure works is that this is the total. Then you get down to the slightly less dark blue lines, and these are major fields. So you have educational services, healthcare, social assistance, other services, which includes a wide variety of services, but in the case of nonprofits, it's pretty much member organizations, religious grant making, civic, professional, those sorts of organizations. Then you have your arts and recreation and an aggregate field for other fields. These light blue lines underneath are part of the medium blue line above them. So these two are part of this. The healthcare, various healthcares are part of this. Now, remember what I said about data suppression. So you're not going to necessarily be able to add these three light blue lines and get this number, because some of those are going to be suppressed on the field, on the subfield level, but they're there. So always look at your dark blue, darker lines, and those are your totals. So there's your employees by field. And as Doug said, 50% of the region's nonprofit employees are in healthcare. And here's your others. And again, similar figure, but this shows what percent of non-government employment is in nonprofits by field and subfield. And as you can see, for instance, only 1.7% of all workers in hospitals in the Hudson Valley region work for for-profit hospitals, similar with colleges and universities, but there are some. Okay, and then just like the report, it's broken down. So we've got employment. Now we're going into wages. Here is that financial data that Doug cited, and the estimated income tax revenue, that's state, and I don't believe New York has local, but so it's federal and state income taxes. It does not, as he said, include any of the sort of other taxes like sales tax or real estate tax, etc. Here's that 7.4 billion in wages. And this is how it breaks down by field. So you can see, well over half of those wages are in healthcare in the region. And then similarly to those above figures, here's the nonprofit wages compared to for-profit wages by field. So as Doug said, in the region, it's about 77 cents to the dollar. So that is better than the state. New York is a bit of an outlier in that. Nationally, the average is about 97 cents to the dollar when comparing the full nonprofit sector to the full for-profit sector. But New York, of course, has a heavy concentration of very highly paid jobs in the financial sector, and that skews that percentage a bit. But as he said, in the fields where nonprofits concentrate, they do tend to pay on par, close to on a par, or even a little bit better than for-profits working in the same fields. In particular, a nonprofit worker in the Hudson Valley in child daycare services is making about $20 more a week than a for-profit worker in that same field. So in that sense, there's some competitiveness. And then we get into our comparisons. During the coronavirus pandemic, this shows, as you can see, the slightly better record of retaining workers in the for-profit sector across the board in the region. But here's what Doug pointed out. The problematic issue is that during that first year of the pandemic, for-profits very aggressively raised wages in several key fields, while nonprofits were not really able to keep up. So that's the general overview of this dashboard. And what you can do here is click on this drop down and find your county. So Westchester, you're going to find a very similar picture to the overall region with the same, generally the same fields available and the same data. However, if you go to a smaller county, I believe Greene is the smallest in the region. So if we go to Greene County, what you'll see is that those data suppression issues come in. So we only have 57 total employees in private nonprofit education services. So that is not broken out into smaller fields because that would provide too much information. So you might be able to identify specific employees or specific organizations. So you're going to have more limited data in your smaller counties. But all of the same figures are here. So you can take a look and see how your county compares to the regional average that is presented in the report. Now, this dashboard is not downloadable entirely, but you can click the download button here and save an image. It's a long image, but if you want one of these figures for a proposal or a report, you can save that image and crop out the figure that you want to use. It's a high quality image. It does allow you to download some of these other things, but I don't recommend it. It's honestly, Tableau doesn't have great formatting. So I just suggest downloading the image. But that can be super useful in a proposal or in an advocacy document. And I will see if there's any questions afterwards, but for now, I think I'm just going to pass this along to Yvette to talk about how her organization fared during this period.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chelsea and Doug, for this work, and it's really important information for nonprofits to have available at their fingertips, especially because we don't always have the resources that we need in order to be able to have this type of data available for foundations and for other kinds of proposals. So I can definitely see our organization certainly using it in that capacity. But in addition to that, I think that oftentimes we, as a community of nonprofits, are working with each other collaboratively and thinking about how can we do better for our employees in terms of just salary and what the market averages are. So this information is certainly going to be very helpful. I have some slides that I want to share just as some talking points in terms of what's happened at Astor over the last couple of years, and I'm hoping that you find it useful. So we were talking about nonprofits and how nonprofits fared off during this pandemic, but I wanted to show you just some information because I thought it was important. I wanted to try to get a sense of, were we at a standstill during the pandemic in terms of hires, because we knew that not a lot of movement was going on at Astor in terms of just individuals leaving. But I wanted to know, did we bring on, how many folks did we bring on? And certainly we didn't bring on as many as we did prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I still thought it was interesting to have 247 new hires of a workforce of about 550 in the Hudson Valley. But what that does show is that we also had a lot of turnover during this period of time. And I want to mention that because we had quite a few employees who, as a result of being essential workers, decided that they did not feel comfortable really being in this environment. We had employees who left because they did not want to either, do home visits, or they did not want to do some of the face-to-face requirements that we have as an organization who provides behavioral health in educational services, our work did not stop. We still had, especially during this time where there was so much crisis, we still had to be able to serve the communities that that were in such high need of our services. So I just wanted to show that despite that we were able to bring on some employees, but we also had really high turnover during this time. I wanted to just kind of give some perspective in terms of the quarter. So we know that during this first quarter, in March, I believe 2020 was when we went on this shutdown, and wanted just to show some, to see if there were any patterns in terms per quarter of hires. And really, there was nothing that stuck out in terms of hires in the Hudson Valley. But like I said, I know that we had some high turnovers because of the essential worker, and in many of services that we provide, we also had to continue to do face-to-face services. Now, the reason why I wanted to share this particular slide on telehealth and telepsychiatry is because this is what we were able to do to make sure that there was continuity of care for the clients that we serve. And the regulations that required us to do face-to-face work became regulations that allowed us to do telehealth and telepsychiatry. As you could see, prior to that first quarter, right prior to the shutdown, Astor was already doing some level of telehealth and telepsychiatry. And as a result of that, we were really able to turn the switch pretty quickly to doing the telehealth work, because we had already some experience with it. Not all nonprofits who were providing services did have that capability as quickly as we did, once again, because we had been doing it already. And as you can see, during this pandemic, we've been able to provide telehealth sessions in the Hudson Valley to over 115,000 telehealth sessions, and telepsychiatry almost at 14,000, which to me, it's amazing. And it tells you that this is a dedicated workforce, that the healthcare workforce is dedicated, and that they want to continue to make sure that the communities that need our services are getting what they need. And because of the flexibilities that we received in the regulations, we were able to get paid for the services that we provided. We are continuing to benefit from those flexibilities. And at this point, it's my understanding that there's waivers and extensions that have continued, and October is a day where we're looking to see whether or not there will be continuation of those regulatory flexibilities. But I really am really grateful to the Hudson Valley employees and the communities and the nonprofits that continue to provide these very needed services. So I thought this slide really represented, especially during those first couple of months, as you can see here, where there was just a lot of fear and we were in lockdown, where we were able to kind of, turn on the switch of having some of these telehealth sessions for those clients that needed it. I wanted to show this because I wanted to see what the impact was of those hires related to the different service areas at Astor. And what I see here is clearly that we didn't hire at the same levels as before the pandemic. But what's interesting to me that I see and that I wanted to share is this other clinical programs. Astor was able to participate in Project Hope. And for those of you that don't know, Project Hope is a program that was developed by the state to address the pandemic and the crisis services that were needed in different communities as a result of the pandemic. So Astor provided services in the Hudson Valley through Project Hope. And so it wasn't unusual for me to see that we had not a huge spike, but a little bit of a spike related to those crisis services, where we engaged more employees and more communities that were in need of services as a result of some of the post-traumatic issues that they were facing because of the pandemic. So, I wanted just to show by service line what the impact was. Our out-of-home placement is residential services that Astor provides. And one of the things that we did, and here we had high turnover, but it was also a time for us where we were doing a huge reset. So we weren't hiring a lot of employees during this time in our out-of-home residential services because we were taking the opportunity to really do a culture shift in our residential services area. So this is just, like I said, a little bit more information about the industry in terms of behavioral and educational services at Astor. Now, so I wish Astor did a market analysis during the pandemic, because we were really interested in seeing how little by little, as we started to come out of the pandemic and started to see more movement in our workforce, we were concerned about how we fared off versus other providers in the Hudson Valley that basically hired similar employees, therapists, psychiatrists, behavior coaches, behavioral specialists. And I wanted to share this, and it's information that I have no problem sharing with the community, because it's good information that we should, as much as possible, have available for our organizations, right? So about 33% of the employee titles that we did a market analysis related to salaries, about 33% of them were under 80% of the market average. So to me as a CEO, that tells me that this is something I need to work on, right? And we were mostly, it wasn't like dramatically where it was, 50s and 30s and 40s. We fared around the 70 to mid 70s. But this told me that from the other partners similar to Astor in the Hudson Valley, that 33% of those titles and those salaries were under that 80% average. But what I'm really proud of is that we do, if you add up the remainder, those 67%, we fare 80% or better of the market average in the Hudson Valley. And in fact, 32% over a third of our positions, we are over 90% of the market average. So it does make me proud that while we're not where the for-profits are, that even with amongst our peers, that we are competitive, and that we're inching our way up to where there's those for-profits salaries are. So this is work that I think it's important work for organizations to have. Along with this report, I'm going to start looking at the dashboard that Chelsea presented to see how the differences between these this market analysis that we have at Astor and what is out there that Chelsea shared with us, what some of those differences are and how we can better enhance what we already have in place. And then the last piece that I wanted to share with everyone is we talk about nonprofits being heavily government funded, and we are. We provide services in both the Hudson Valley and the Bronx, and the Hudson Valley represents about 70% of our agency's $63 million budget. But as you'll see from here, about 60, I would say even more than 60%, because we know Medicaid managed care is a federal and state funded program. So a large portion of our funding does come from government, and our partnerships with government are really critical, with county government even more critical. So it's we're always looking at how do we not only diversify our funding, but how do we collaborate with our state, our city, our local governments to be in a position to share with them the importance of these cost of living increases and the other, employee recruitment and retention strategies that organizations like Astor have to do in order to make sure that we continue to be competitive. So that's my presentation and my slides. I hope you found them helpful. I know that this report is certainly going to make a difference for us in the way that we look at the industry, at the way that we look at the Hudson Valley and where other providers are. And I would just say I would encourage others to use it in similar ways. And I am willing to answer any questions that I can. So I'll turn it over to Andrea, I think.
Actually, it's going to be Doug. Doug's going to.
Okay, Doug.
Thank you.
Thank you, Yvette. Open it up for questions or anything that people want to share in their own experience. I will say, in listening to Yvette's presentation and her forward-looking in terms of taking strategies, working in a place like Astor, or working in a residential facility of any kind, or a childcare facility, there are licenses, there's trainings, there's risks associated. It's not like working at a McDonald's. So when you're getting paid the same amount of money, but there's a lot more stress working in nonprofits and/or a lot more you have to go through. It doesn't make it a lot easier. I don't know if Yvette, you might want to talk about that, because a lot of the comparative jobs in the for-profit sector may be paying what you pay, do not have all the regulations attached around the jobs, or the training and licensing requirements that may be necessary.
You're absolutely correct, Doug, and that is part of the challenge. That's why organizations like Astor over the last year have started to do more look at, really strategize much more about, okay, how do we, those line level positions, how do we become more competitive? And it's not even how do we do it, we have to do it. These are not choices that we have. We can't expect an employee to have to comply with the many regulations that we have, and also have to be in a position where they could have an allegation called against them, or where they may have a child that may have behavior issues that, the employee could be hurt and not do right by those employees. So nonprofits and organizations that work with children like Astor, especially in residential services, we don't have choices anymore. The choice isn't, can we raise salaries? The choice is, the reality is that we have to raise salaries. Because the need exists, and we have to take care of our employees. So it is a challenge, but it's no longer an option.
How flexible are you seeing, because you have a lot of government contracts allowing you to use their money to raise salaries or raise benefits at the same time? How much flexibility have you been experiencing?
Well, for anyone that's been following the New York State and even the city budget knows that this year's budget was by far the most helpful and to behavioral health and healthcare professionals in general. We received that 5.4% cost of living increase, which we've not seen in our industry. We have seen increases in rates that we haven't seen in many years, including to different types of models. So this year, I think we've been screaming workforce retention, recruitment for the last couple of years, and finally the state and the city started to hear us, and we have definitely seen some of the most rewarding pieces of the state and city budget benefiting nonprofits and healthcare, especially in the work that we do at Astor. So they're listening, and we're seeing workforce bonuses that are coming down the pipeline as a result of the state budget. We're seeing COLAs, and we're seeing rate increases, which we hope to continue to see in future budgets.
Thank you. Any questions from anybody in the audience? Ideas, suggestions, use of the data for advocacy purposes? Obviously, I think we're entering where workforce is the key word now moving forward in terms of what our workforce is, how we care for them, how we compensate them, and how we keep retaining them. Any questions anybody has? Put in the chat.
Doug, if I may add just something else, flexibility of the workforce has become extremely key to the success of any nonprofit. And what's challenging is that in healthcare, yes, we have telehealth and telepsychiatry that we're able to use, but there are many services within the scope of practice that we engage in that don't allow for that. And therefore, I would say that as nonprofits, we have to be very creative, and we have to provide our employees the levels of flexibility that will allow that where they will want to continue to be employed in our industry, where they will want to continue to be employed doing the work that they do. So developing hybrid models has really become a critical part of ensuring the workforce and growth in workforce in our industry. If we're not able to be flexible and we're not able to be creative around this work, we're not going to be in a position to be competitive either.
And I know in your field, particularly maybe in clinical services, getting qualified clinicians who are also bilingual is quite the priority, and a premium price. Correct. As well. Yeah.
Yeah. And what we have been fortunate is that we actually advocated both the state legislature and the city council for member item funding for bilingual workers and bilingual professional development. And I'm pleased to say that so far we know we've received about $200,000 worth of member item funding for this coming year for bilingual workforce specifically. So we're well aware of that need, and we made it clear to the legislature and the city council members that we wouldn't be successful if we don't have that funding. And I'm glad to say that, you know, we have secured some funding for that specific bilingual need.
There's a question, I guess I'll open it up to anybody in the panel, or if anyone else has comments about in taking the report and advocating to elected officials, what's the most relevant findings? My own view is it just points the necessity during COVID and the reliance on essential workforce. Nonprofit workforce is important. It's not a side, it's not just a philanthropy, it's not just a charity. It's a critical piece of the community. And I think that's undervalued by elected officials. They take it for granted often. And emphasizing that, and emphasizing the need for us to have a competitive workforce, which also means that we cannot continue doing more with less, more with less, more with less, and be able to do what we do and do it with impact. It's also, and I guess from an economic development strategy perspective, when we often talk about at the local level around economic development, they often aren't talking about nonprofits as part of economic development. They see that as separate from the for-profit. I think it's important for elected officials to see nonprofits as being vital to economic development. Certainly arts and recreation and cultural field has made that point very clearly, that they bring people to the community and there's spin-off of the dollars. I'm not so sure that the rest of the sector has made that point. Maybe healthcare has. So that's my own impression. I don't know whether Chelsea, Andrea, Yvette, you may have any comments about how it can be, what parts of it can be used most effectively for advocacy.
I would say, you know, I've been doing a lot of advocacy over the last couple of years, and there isn't one elected official that I have come across that has not asked me, how many people do you employ in my district, and how many individuals do you serve in my district?
Voters.
So anything that the report if there is an opportunity in the report to tease out or to look at any level of that type of data, I would definitely use the report in any way you can to speak specifically to those members' districts. You know, I have found, and I don't want to say that they're not interested in the county. Of course they are, but they're definitely interested in being able to see the impact of the work that the nonprofits are doing related to the constituents that they serve. So you start, even if you have to start broad with the information in the report and use some of your own data to use it collaboratively, that's how I would use this report, because they don't want, and oftentimes they have said to us, you know, the nonprofit sector does not advocate for themselves the way that they should. And part of the reason why is because of capacity. We don't always have the capacity to pull all the nitty-gritty of the data. And this report is allowing you to have some of that information. So use it as much as possible and piece together what other little bit you have in your organization and start showing them some of those numbers. Even if you have to drill down by zip codes, that makes a difference to them.
Another piece on that, which kind of goes along that, when you look at your individual nonprofit, if you have a $1 million budget or $5 million budget, it's not just a budget. We do business with vendors in the community. We buy food, we buy copy machines, we pay for services. There's a lot of for-profits that make money off of nonprofits because we do business exchange with them. I remember a community back 10, 12 years ago, the nonprofits came together, they listed out all their vendors, the for-profit vendors, and they took out a full-page ad in the paper saying, here's who we do business with. And it's a good way to show that the for-profit sector, the for-profit businesses actually are partners and are beneficiaries of our business practices. And it's not just within the nonprofit itself. So.
We also have a question that just came in. So what are some practical next steps on how to use these findings? In particular, they're looking for some potential high value activities for, you know, like Yvette was talking about, capacity, right? For these small to medium sized nonprofits. What would you suggest some next steps from today would be?
I guess there could be two approaches. One is communities or counties can get together, nonprofits, to show the collective impact and advocate collectively. And there's also the individual nonprofit trying to show their value to elected officials or the public. And I think it's not just elected officials, it's the general public most of them don't understand what a nonprofit is to begin with, much less how we operate and how we do business. So there's sticker shock of saying, well, you got this much budget. Well, they a lot of myths. So I think we use the data to destroy the myths and use the data to really emphasize our economic importance as an industry, just economically as well as our mission. But that can happen at the individual level. That also can happen on a collective level. And even see executives group or when they're really looking at how they can do collectively and then go to the local officials or go to the newspapers. I know we had put out a press release on the study. We got some coverage, but not a lot. If we were another industry, we probably would have gotten more coverage in the business papers and whatnot. And so I think we really have to take it and really sound it loud and not let it be buried. I don't know if that's helping, but I think we really need to amplify the point of the study, as well as the workforce point, as well as the competitive workforce point, as well as the our economic value is a lot. And the community is relying on that economic. As long as we can keep the same themes going, whether you're applying it to your individual funders, whether you're applying it to donors, or whether you're applying it to grants or to elected officials to see the value is more than just your mission to their community. And I think as Yvette is talking about, they want to see you have workers that vote in their district. That's an important piece for them to understand.
And I would also add, Doug, that many nonprofits work in multiple counties. So I would just say, you know, as an organization that works, you know, that has services and locations in Dutchess and in Orange and Ulster and many, I want to look at the data as the next step. I want to look at these dashboards and look at the data to see what the differences are in the counties and see what the impact of those differences could be and may be in my organization. So I would definitely use that data. If you're providing services in multiple counties, look at those counties and what the report is saying and see whether or not there's an impact to those differences that maybe you could leverage as well.
And there is a question here about the return on investment, the social impact for every dollar being spent. I can say I'll turn to the economic. We did toy around, and Chelsea can talk about this around the economic impact of a dollar going into a nonprofit. How does that turn over $7, $10, $12 to the economy? And there's not a lot of consensus on models, at least on the economic impact. Chelsea, do you want to talk about that for a minute?
I'm basically just going to say that there are so many different ways of calculating that, and it's not something that I have familiarity with. I think when we were doing this, we sort of came up with such a insanely wide range using different approaches that we chose not to pursue that portion of this. I'm afraid I just don't have much insight into it because it is not something we've ever attempted to do within the scope of these sorts of reports.
When you get into social return, not necessarily economic return, that's where you start. That's industry specific. If you're in childcare and you're keeping people in jobs and off welfare, say, or keeping them employed, or prevention programs, there are keeping people out of foster care systems, or prevention programs are keeping people out of criminal justice systems. I think everybody's got you got to do your own analysis within that field in terms of what a dollar returns what. In terms of it's tough to prove what doesn't happen. It's tough to prove the negative. So I think it's up to each field. Arts has done a very good job in turning dollars. It's tough to say what it contributes to quality of life. They do it by customers and people they bring and people will spend money in the community. I think the most standard is $7 for every dollar that is spent in arts and entertainment is turned over in that community. The social return is much more difficult in terms of was a social experience, a cultural experience mean, and how's that return? It's an interesting question.
Yes, it is. We are coming up on sort of the end of our time here together. And one of the things I also want to throw out to the group that's gathered here is if there's interest in getting training regarding advocacy work with elected officials, let us know that, because we would be willing to do something about that. But this has been very enlightening. Thank you all so much for your participation. Thank you, Yvette, Chelsea, and Doug, for your information and expertise. Please don't forget to visit the Hudson Valley Funders Network website at hudsonvalleyfundersnetwork.org for this webinar recording, which will also be on the Nikon website, as well as other information and resources that may be of use to propel your mission. Doug, Yvette, and Chelsea, thank you so much. This was really terrific and edifying. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.